Shattered Realities, A Mirror's Dark Secret Unveiled. Psychological Thriller. Chapter 1. The Reflections Call. Evelyn Harper stood at the entrance of the old Victorian house, the scent of damp wood and faint traces of dust filling her lungs. It had been years since she'd last stepped foot inside her childhood home, but the memories still lingered like ghosts haunting the dark corners. The house was quiet, unnervingly so, as if it was waiting for something, for her. The house had belonged to her family for generations, passed down like a piece of history none of them could truly leave behind. But now it was empty, save for her. Liam, her younger brother, had been the last to live here, until his sudden death just months ago. The official cause was an accident, though Evelyn never truly believed it. There had been too many unanswered questions, too many late-night calls from Liam, calls filled with fear, ramblings about something he couldn't fully explain. And now she was back, standing in the threshold of their shared past, her mind a swirl of emotions, grief, regret, guilt. She wasn't sure if she'd come for closure or to find answers to the questions that gnawed at her soul. But whatever the reason, the weight of the house felt heavier now, as if it too mourned Liam's loss. She wandered through the dimly lit halls, each creaking floorboard beneath her feet sending a shiver up her spine. The house was in disrepair, but she couldn't bring herself to care. Everything felt wrong without Liam, the emptiness magnified by the stillness. As she ascended the narrow staircase to the attic, her hand traced the railings, her fingertips brushing over the familiar nicks and scratches they'd made as children. The attic had always been a place of mystery for them growing up, a dusty, cluttered space filled with relics from their family's past. But now, as she unlocked the door and stepped inside, it felt suffocating, as if the very air had turned thick with memories long buried. She set to work, rummaging through the scattered boxes and forgotten belongings, her movements mechanical, almost as if her body was on autopilot while her mind remained elsewhere. It wasn't until she stumbled upon an old, tarnished object tucked away in the far corner that her pulse quickened. The mirror was large, far too ornate to be forgotten so easily. Its frame was carved in intricate patterns of twisted vines and delicate flowers, the once golden surface now dulled by time. There was something about it, something that made her skin prickle. She stepped closer, her reflection coming into view, though she couldn't help but feel as if the glass was watching her, rather than the other way around. She frowned, leaning in. The surface of the mirror was slightly fogged, as if it had captured a breath that lingered just beneath the surface. Wiping it with her sleeve, she blinked, startled to see her reflection clearer now. But something wasn't quite right. Her eyes seemed off, almost like they belonged to someone else entirely. Evelyn took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. Liam had mentioned the mirror once in one of his frantic calls. He'd said it had shown him things no one should ever see. But she had dismissed it as nonsense, a product of his fraying mental state. She hadn't realized he'd brought the mirror here. Evelyn. The voice was faint, almost like a whisper carried on the wind, but it made her stop dead in her tracks. Her breath caught in her throat. The sound was unmistakable. It was Liam's voice. "Liam?" she called out, her voice shaky. The house remained silent, but the air around her felt charged, electric. She turned slowly, her gaze flicking back to the mirror, but there was nothing. Just her reflection staring back at her, wide-eyed and pale. Evelyn shook her head, pressing her fingers to her temples. She hadn't slept well since Liam's death, and the stress was clearly getting to her. It had to be. She was imagining things, wasn't she? But as she turned to leave the attic, she caught a glimmer out of the corner of her eye. It was quick, barely perceptible, but it was enough to send a jolt of cold fear through her veins. A figure, just behind her reflection. There, in the mirror. She spun around, heart hammering in her chest, but the attic was empty. The mirror stood still, its surface dull and lifeless once more. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she clutched the edges of an old box, trying to steady herself. Maybe she hadn't imagined the voice. Maybe something about the mirror was tied to Liam's death, after all. Her curiosity, mixed with fear, began to take root. She knew there was more to the story than what the police had concluded, and if the mirror was the key, she had no choice but to find out what it was hiding. The days that followed were restless, filled with strange dreams that left her waking in a cold sweat. In her dreams, she saw Liam. His face twisted in fear as he reached out to her from behind the mirror, trapped in a world she couldn't reach. Every time she would hear his voice calling her name, begging for help. The lines between reality and nightmare were beginning to blur. Determined to uncover the truth, Evelyn buried herself in research. The mirror had been in the family for generations, passed down from one relative to the next. But the more she dug, the darker the history seemed. Reports of sudden illnesses, tragic accidents, and unexplained deaths surrounded its previous owners. She found old newspaper clippings and journal entries from family members long gone, all hinting at the mirror's ominous influence. And then, in a stack of old letters, she found something. A note scribbled in Liam's familiar handwriting, dated just weeks before his death. "I was wrong. It's not just a mirror. It's watching me, Evelyn. I can feel it. I think it's going to take me. I need to destroy it before it's too late. Please don't trust it. Don't let it in. I'm sorry." The note sent a chill through her. Liam had known something that had terrified him. But what exactly had he meant? What had he seen in the mirror that drove him to such fear? Evelyn stared at the note, her hands shaking. And as her gaze drifted back to the mirror across the room, her reflection blinked at her. Only, this time, she hadn't blinked at all. The breath caught in her throat and she took a step back. Her pulse quickened. Slowly, almost against her will, she turned to face the mirror. There, behind the glass, something moved. Something she knew shouldn't be there. It was Liam. His face was pale, hollow, his eyes wide with terror. And as he reached out towards her, his mouth opened in a silent scream, the sound of her name echoing in her mind. Evelyn. Chapter 2. Into the Looking Glass. Evelyn's days began to blur together, the passing hours marked only by her encounters with the mirror. What had started as a grim curiosity was quickly turning into something much darker. Every time she walked past it, she felt its pull, like an invisible hand tugging at her consciousness, begging her to return. And she did, again and again, unable to resist. The more she stared into the glass, the more she noticed things that didn't make sense, little details that made her question her own sanity. At first it was small, her reflection holding its gaze a moment too long, the glint of a smile flickering across its lips, even when her face remained still. But soon, those discrepancies grew more pronounced, more unsettling. There were moments when her reflection would shift slightly, as if it were someone else entirely, mimicking her, but with a will of its own. She began to study it, her heart racing every time she approached the mirror. If she raised her hand, her reflection hesitated, as though waiting to see what she would do. When she turned her head, the mirrored image followed, but not perfectly in sync. It was always a beat too late, just enough to make her skin crawl. One evening, after another sleepless night haunted by the voice of her brother, Evelyn stood in front of the mirror for what felt like hours. The room was cold, the dim light casting shadows along the wooden floorboards, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were locked on the reflection. She slowly lifted her hand, testing it. Her reflection mirrored the movement, but there was something different this time. Its fingers curled ever so slightly, almost like it was reaching out for her, rather than merely copying her actions. Her chest tightened, the air thick with tension. Her reflection's eyes bore into her, darker than they should have been, the gleam of something sinister behind them. For a brief moment, it smiled, really smiled, and Evelyn's stomach churned with dread. That wasn't her. It couldn't be. A knock at the door shattered the silence, and Evelyn gasped, her head snapping away from the mirror. Her heart pounded in her chest as she hurried down the hall, leaving the attic behind, grateful for the distraction. She opened the door to find a familiar face. David, her ex-boyfriend. He stood there, hands shoved into his pockets, concern etched across his face. He hadn't changed much, his sandy hair still slightly disheveled, his jaw clenched in that way it always did when he was worried. "Evelyn," he greeted her, his voice low. "You don't look great." Evelyn gave a weak smile, stepping aside to let him in. She hadn't spoken to David in months, not since Liam's death. They had grown distant even before that, but something about his sudden presence made her both relieved and anxious. "What are you doing here, David?" she asked, leaning against the wall as he walked into the living room. "I heard about Liam," he said, turning to face her, his eyes softening with sympathy. "I know we haven't really talked, but I wanted to check on you. I've been worried." "I'm fine," she lied, crossing her arms defensively. David gave her a look that told her he wasn't buying it. "You've been avoiding people? I called a few times, but..." He trailed off, his gaze scanning the room. "This place looks worse than I remember. Are you really okay?" Evelyn bit her lip, unsure how to explain the things she had seen. The reflection, the strange dreams, the feeling that something was watching her. She could already see the doubt in his eyes, the skepticism lurking beneath his concern. "It's the mirror," she blurted out before she could stop herself. David raised an eyebrow, his head tilting slightly. "The mirror? There's something wrong with it. I don't know how to explain it, but I think it's connected to Liam's death." Her voice wavered as she spoke, the weight of her words hanging in the air. David sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Evelyn, I know you're going through a lot. Losing Liam, it's hard. But blaming an old mirror? Come on. You know that's not real." "It is real," she snapped, the frustration bubbling to the surface. "I've seen things. Liam was obsessed with that mirror before he died. He was trying to destroy it. He left a note. He knew something was wrong with it." David frowned, glancing toward the stairs. "Look, I'm not trying to dismiss what you're feeling, but it sounds like grief talking. You're not thinking clearly." "I'm not imagining this." Evelyn's voice rose, her hands trembling as she tried to explain the unexplainable. "The mirror is different. My reflection, sometimes it moves when I don't. It's like it's alive. It's doing things behind my back, David." He stared at her, concern deepening into something that looked like pity. "Evelyn, you need to get out of here for a while. This house, it's not helping. You're just torturing yourself staying here." "I can't leave," she whispered, her eyes darting back toward the attic door. "I have to figure out what happened to him." David took a step toward her, his hands reaching out as if he could pull her back from the edge. "You're not going to find answers here, Evelyn. You're just going to drive yourself crazy." But she wasn't crazy. At least, she didn't think she was. Yet the more time she spent staring into that mirror, the more doubt crept into her mind. Her reflection had started whispering to her at night, soft murmurs that felt like they were seeping into her thoughts. The words were faint, just out of reach, but they planted seeds of suspicion. "Don't trust him," it would say, its voice eerily familiar yet foreign. "He's trying to take you away from the truth, just like the others." Evelyn shook her head, trying to clear the fog that clouded her mind. "I'm not leaving," she said firmly, pulling away from David's touch. Frustrated, David glanced toward the attic. "What is it about this mirror? What do you think it's going to show you?" Evelyn swallowed hard, unsure of how to explain what she herself didn't fully understand. "I don't know, but I have to find out." That night, after David left, Evelyn found herself drawn back to the attic. She stood before the mirror, her reflection waiting for her as if it had been expecting her all along. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Her fingers brushed the cool surface of the frame, and for a moment she swore the glass rippled beneath her touch. As she stared into the reflection, something shifted. Her reflection didn't move this time, didn't mimic her as it always had. It stood perfectly still, its dark eyes locked onto hers, an eerie smile creeping across its face. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she took a step back, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Suddenly, the reflection raised its hand, even though she hadn't moved. Evelyn froze, terror gripping her as her reflection reached toward her, the fingers pressing against the glass from the inside. "No," she whispered, stumbling back, her body trembling with fear. But it was too late. The reflection pushed through, its hand breaking free of the glass, reaching for her. Evelyn screamed, her voice echoing through the empty attic. She spun around, trying to flee, but the world tilted, the floor vanishing beneath her feet. When she opened her eyes, the room was silent. She stood motionless, her breath shaky and uneven. But something was wrong. Her surroundings were no longer familiar. She was still in the attic, or what looked like the attic, but everything felt distant, blurred around the edges. She turned toward the mirror, her heart dropping as she realized the horrifying truth. She was inside it. Her reflection was no longer a reflection at all. It was her, living, breathing, smiling back at her from the other side. Evelyn pressed her hands against the cold glass, panic rising in her chest. The other Evelyn turned away, walking back into the house, leaving her trapped, watching, powerless to escape. Chapter 3. The Other Side. Evelyn opened her eyes to darkness, a thick, oppressive gloom that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. For a moment she wasn't sure if she was awake or still trapped in some lingering nightmare. The air felt dense, as if the walls of this strange, twisted place were closing in on her. Slowly, she pushed herself to her feet, her body aching as though she'd been lying in that suffocating darkness for hours. As she stood, she realized that she wasn't alone. The attic was still there, but it wasn't the attic she knew. Everything seemed warped, stretched unnaturally, like looking through cracked glass. Shadows crawled along the floor, twisting and writhing in impossible shapes, and the familiar furniture was bent out of proportion, looming over her like silent sentinels. Her heart hammered in her chest as she turned in a slow circle, taking in her new surroundings. Was this inside the mirror? Had she truly been pulled into the glass? The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This was no dream. This was real. She was trapped. Her gaze darted toward the mirror, but the surface, once so reflective, now appeared dull and lifeless, a hazy fog swirling within the glass. And there, on the other side, was the reflection, her reflection, moving with disturbing ease as it navigated her world, her life. Evelyn watched in horror as the reflection walked through the house as if nothing had changed. It smiled, it moved, it breathed, all with a sense of freedom that Evelyn had lost. She raised her hand, pressing it against the cold, smooth surface of the mirror, her fingers trembling as she tried to push through. But it was no use. The glass remained solid, unyielding. "No, this can't be happening," she whispered, panic creeping into her voice. She pounded her fists against the glass, her reflection unaffected, oblivious to her frantic attempts to escape. Tears pricked her eyes as she watched the other Evelyn carry on, her movements smooth, graceful, almost calculated. A sharp, metallic laugh echoed from behind her, sending a chill down her spine. "You finally made it," a voice called out from the shadows. Evelyn whirled around, her heart seizing in her chest. From the darkened corner of the room, a figure stepped into the faint, distorted light. A figure she knew all too well. Liam? Her voice was barely a whisper, disbelief clouding her senses. There, standing before her, was her brother. His familiar features were there, the messy hair, the sharp jawline, but something was different. His eyes were sunken, hollow, as though they had seen too much, and his skin had a ghostly pallor, stretched tight over his bones. Liam gave her a crooked smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It took you long enough." Evelyn staggered backward, her mind racing. How are you here? You're supposed to be dead?" Liam finished, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah, I guess that's one way to look at it." Evelyn's breath hitched in her throat. "But David said you..." She couldn't find the words, the confusion wrapping around her thoughts like a thick fog. Liam took a step closer, his expression somber. "I tried to warn you, Evelyn. I left the notes. I tried to tell you what was happening, but it was too late for me." She stared at him, her mind struggling to piece together the fragmented realities she now faced. "Warn me? About what? What is this place?" Liam's face hardened, his jaw tightening. "This is what's inside the mirror, Eve. It doesn't just reflect you, it takes you. It traps your soul in here, and once you're caught, there's no way out." His voice was bitter, filled with a weariness that only someone who had been trapped for far too long could understand. Evelyn's heart sank. "But you were trying to destroy it. Why didn't it work?" Liam let out a hollow laugh, devoid of any real humor. "I was too late. By the time I realized what was happening, it had already taken me. That's how it works, Evelyn. It waits until you're vulnerable, until you start doubting yourself, and then it replaces you." She shook her head, unwilling to accept what she was hearing. "No, there has to be a way out. There has to be." Liam's gaze darkened, his voice low and serious. "There is a way," he said slowly, as if choosing his words carefully. "But it's not easy, and it's not something you're going to like." Evelyn swallowed, her throat tight. "What do you mean?" "You can break free, but to escape, someone else has to take your place." His words hung heavy in the air, each syllable like a weight pressing down on her chest. Evelyn's blood ran cold. "What?" Liam's eyes were distant, haunted by something she couldn't quite understand. That's how the mirror works. It thrives on betrayal, on fear. It feeds on desperation. To escape, someone else has to be pulled in. That's the price. Evelyn stared at him, horror creeping up her spine. No, I can't do that. I can't trap someone else in here. Liam stepped closer, his expression a mix of pain and urgency. You think I wanted this? You think I haven't been trying to find another way? I've been here for months, Evelyn. There is no other way. It's either you or someone else. Her mind reeled at the thought, a sickening wave of guilt crashing over her. How could she even consider condemning someone else to this nightmare? There has to be another way, she whispered, more to herself than to him. Liam shook his head, his voice hard. There isn't. You have to accept that. Evelyn turned away, pacing as her thoughts raced. Her hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white. This couldn't be happening. There had to be something she could do, something that didn't involve damning another person to this hell. Who did this to you? She asked suddenly, her voice filled with a desperate edge. Who pulled you into the mirror? Liam's face twisted with a bitter smile. It wasn't just one person. It's been passed down for years, each victim replacing the last. Evelyn's stomach churned at the thought of countless souls trapped, lost inside this cursed glass. Her brother was one of them now, and if she didn't find a way out, she would be too. Maybe, if we destroy it from the inside, she suggested, her voice trembling with hope. Liam's expression darkened. I've tried that, Evelyn. Believe me, but it's not that simple. The mirror is stronger than you think. It's been feeding on fear, betrayal, for centuries. Her chest tightened, the weight of the situation crushing her hope. Could she really live the rest of her life here, trapped in this twisted version of reality, watching as her reflection lived out her life in the real world? Her mind raced, torn between the desire to escape and the gnawing guilt that came with knowing the cost. As Liam's words sank deeper into her consciousness, Evelyn began to question everything. Could she trust him? Was he telling her the truth, or was this place warping his mind as well? How long had he been here? What if the mirror had already consumed him, turning him into something else, something dangerous? Doubt gnawed at her, the lines between reality and illusion blurring further with each passing moment. Chapter 4: The Mirror's Game. The oppressive darkness of the mirror realm began to feel alive, as though it was watching Evelyn and Liam, feeding on their desperation. Every shadow seemed to twist and warp, taking on grotesque shapes that made Evelyn's skin crawl. She tried to focus on her brother, but the atmosphere felt suffocating, pressing down on her thoughts like a heavy, unyielding weight. They had been searching for what felt like hours, days even. It was impossible to tell time in this place, where everything was distorted and unfamiliar. The walls of the house seemed to stretch and contort, constantly shifting just beyond the edge of her vision. The more Evelyn looked at them, the more they seemed to melt into each other, creating a labyrinth of endless rooms and twisting hallways. We're not getting out, are we? Evelyn muttered, her voice a mix of frustration and fear. Her steps slowed as exhaustion set in, her body aching from the tension. Liam walked beside her, his face set in a grim expression. I don't know, but we have to keep trying. The mirror feeds on doubt. If we give up, we're done for. Evelyn wanted to believe him, but each step forward felt heavier than the last. The more they explored, the more it became clear that this wasn't just a twisted reflection of their world. It was something far worse. The house, their house, was filled with echoes of the past, but they were wrong, twisted in horrifying ways. Sometimes she would hear the creak of footsteps behind her, only to turn and find nothing but shadows. Other times, distorted voices echoed through the walls, voices she recognized but couldn't place. Every room they entered was just slightly off, like a warped memory, and each glance into the shifting darkness made her doubt her own sanity. As they continued down a narrow hallway, the walls began to close in, becoming claustrophobically tight. Evelyn's breath quickened, and she wiped the cold sweat from her forehead. You hear that? She whispered, her eyes darting nervously around. Liam paused, his gaze distant. It's the mirror. It wants to mess with our heads. As if on cue, the walls around them started to ripple like water, and the shadows deepened. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and a familiar voice echoed from the darkness. Evelyn, Her breath hitched. It was their mother's voice, soft and warm, exactly as she remembered from childhood. But there was something wrong about it, something hollow and distant, as though it was coming from far, far away. "Evelyn, come here." The voice sent a chill through her, and she took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. "No, that's not real," she whispered, shaking her head. Liam grabbed her arm, his grip tight. "Don't listen to it. It's trying to get into your head." But the voice grew louder, more insistent. "Evelyn, please, I need you." It wasn't just their mother's voice anymore. Now she heard David too, his tone full of concern. "Evelyn, where are you? I'm worried about you." The sound of his voice hit her like a wave, washing over her with a strange mix of comfort and terror. "David?" she called out before realizing how foolish she sounded. Of course it wasn't him. David was in the real world. He couldn't reach her here. But the mirror knew her weaknesses, knew exactly how to pull at her heartstrings. "Evelyn, come back to me." David's voice whispered again, this time so close she could almost feel his breath on her neck. She spun around, expecting to see his face, but there was nothing. Just endless, writhing shadows. "Stop it," she screamed, pressing her hands over her ears. "Just stop." Liam's voice cut through the growing chaos, sharp and commanding. "It's not real. None of this is real." But the voices didn't stop. Instead, the mirror began to play their worst fears before their eyes, forcing them to relive moments they had buried deep within their minds. Every fear, every regret, every shameful memory was pulled to the surface, paraded before them in grotesque, exaggerated ways. Evelyn saw herself standing over Liam's grave, alone and abandoned. Everyone she loved gone from her life. She saw David walking away, leaving her behind with nothing but regret and sorrow. And then she saw herself, her reflection, living the life she had lost, smiling, happy, loved. The image twisted her gut. She watched as the reflection of herself, now in her place in the real world, charmed their friends, comforted their mother, and wrapped her arms around David in a way Evelyn never could. It was perfect, flawless, better in every way than Evelyn had ever been. The mirror didn't just show them their fears, it manipulated them, molded them into something far worse. Evelyn's chest tightened with a suffocating sense of dread. Her brother's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. "It's trying to break you down," Liam warned, his eyes never leaving hers. "It shows you the worst parts of yourself to make you give in." Evelyn tried to focus, tried to shut out the awful visions. But one image kept replaying in her mind, the reflection, smiling as it leaned in to kiss David, perfectly mimicking the life Evelyn had always dreamed of but had never managed to live. Tears filled her eyes. "What if it's true?" she whispered, the doubt gnawing at her. "What if she really is better than me?" Liam's face twisted in frustration. "That's what it wants you to think. It's not real, Evelyn. None of it is. That thing isn't you." But the seed had been planted, and the mirror knew it. As they continued their search, Evelyn found it harder and harder to push away the doubts creeping into her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her reflection living her life with ease, while she was trapped in this nightmare. And then, as if sensing her weakening resolve, the mirror shifted tactics. It began to whisper again, this time with a new, insidious voice. "You can have it all back, Evelyn. Just let go. Let me live for you." The voice was sickly sweet, dripping with temptation. Evelyn stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. What if she's right, she thought, the idea taking root despite her best efforts to push it away. What if the reflection really could do a better job? What if her life was better off without her? Liam, sensing her hesitation, grabbed her arm, his voice fierce. "Don't listen to it. It's lying." But the reflection's voice continued, soothing, tempting. "I can fix everything, Evelyn. You'll never have to suffer again. Just let go." Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the voice. But it was so hard. She was so tired. The weight of the mirror's game was crushing her, pushing her closer and closer to the edge. Liam's voice came again, a desperate plea. "You can't trust it, Evelyn. Not even me. You have to stay strong." She opened her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know if I can." As the darkness pressed in around them, Evelyn felt the mirror's grip tightening, its sinister influence crawling deeper into her mind. It wanted her to break, wanted her to give in. And she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. Chapter 5. Shattered Realities. Evelyn's mind swirled with the weight of all she had learned. The mirror wasn't just a strange object. It was a cursed artifact with a dark history that spanned centuries. She stood in the dim, distorted realm, listening to Liam's somber voice as he explained its origins. It was created by an ancient group, an occult order, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His face was pale, the weight of his own guilt hanging visibly on his features. They made it as a way to trap souls, to feed off their negative emotions. The more fear, regret, and pain it causes, the stronger it becomes. I should have told you sooner. I should have acted before it was too late. Evelyn's heart raced as she absorbed the enormity of it all. The mirror wasn't just a supernatural oddity, it was an insidious weapon designed to imprison and torment. Her hands trembled as she looked at Liam, her mind racing with questions and accusations. You knew this whole time? You knew, and you didn't do anything? He nodded, the shame evident in his expression. I was scared. I thought if I didn't interfere, maybe I could find a way out on my own. But the mirror, it twists everything, including your mind. It makes you doubt yourself, makes you feel powerless. Evelyn clenched her fists, her anger rising. She wanted to scream at him, to demand why he hadn't warned her sooner. But she knew deep down that fear was a powerful motivator. The mirror had done the same thing to her. It had whispered doubts, preyed on her insecurities, and made her question everything she thought she knew. But now, with the truth laid bare, she felt her resolve harden. She wouldn't be a passive victim in this twisted game any longer. In the real world, David was growing increasingly suspicious. The woman who claimed to be Evelyn, the one who looked and acted like her, had begun to show cracks in her facade. Subtle things, small details in her behavior, her speech, the way she carried herself, were different. David had spent years with the real Evelyn. He knew her better than anyone. And this imposter, this reflection, wasn't her. Late one night, after the reflection had gone to sleep, David started to dig deeper into the mirror's history. His research had led him down a dark rabbit hole of occult lore and forbidden rituals. He found mention of an ancient order that had crafted mirrors as vessels to trap souls, feeding off the emotions of those captured within. His blood ran cold as he realized the truth. The mirror in Evelyn's house wasn't just cursed, it was actively devouring her. The person he had been interacting with wasn't Evelyn at all, but a twisted doppelganger designed to mimic her. He had been fooled. Armed with this revelation, David made a decision. He had to destroy the mirror, break its hold on Evelyn, and free her from whatever hellish prison she had been trapped in. But as he approached the cursed object, the reflection awoke. You don't understand, David, the reflection said, her voice soft but laced with menace. I am Evelyn. I'm the part of her that was always stronger, more confident, more capable. I can give you everything you ever wanted, everything she couldn't. She smiled, the expression unnerving, and took a step toward him. If you destroy the mirror, you destroy her. Is that what you want? David's hands shook, his grip tightening around the sledgehammer he had brought. You're not her, I know Evelyn. And you're a lie. In the mirror realm, Evelyn could feel the tension building. The mirror was growing more agitated, its power tightening around her and Liam like an ever-present weight. The walls seemed to pulse, a rhythmic beat that resonated in her skull, making it hard to think. She could feel the mirror's influence trying to get inside her mind, planting seeds of doubt. You'll never escape, a voice whispered. It was her own voice, but twisted, malicious. The reflection had returned, and this time it was more aggressive. David's going to break the mirror, and when he does, you'll disappear. You'll be trapped here forever, forgotten, while I live your life, better than you ever did. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She could feel her grasp on reality slipping, the edges of her sanity fraying. Was the reflection right? If David destroyed the mirror, would she truly be lost forever? You have to act now, Liam urged, his voice harsh and insistent. If David smashes that mirror, we'll both be trapped, forever. There's only one way out, Evelyn. We have to break it from the inside. But remember, someone else has to take our place. Evelyn recoiled at the thought. No, there has to be another way. I'm not sacrificing someone else to save myself. Liam's eyes darkened and his tone turned cold. That's the way it works. The mirror was designed to trap souls. It thrives on fear and betrayal. If you want to get out, You have to let someone else take your place. A shiver ran down Evelyn's spine. For the first time, she looked at Liam with suspicion. Why was he pushing her so hard? What was he really after? Why are you so eager for me to make that choice? What aren't you telling me? Liam hesitated, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. For a moment, Evelyn thought she saw a flicker of something darker in his expression, something sinister. You can't trust anyone here, he finally said, his voice low. Not even me. Evelyn's heart sank. She didn't know who or what to believe anymore. The reflection, Liam, the mirror itself, it all felt like a carefully orchestrated game designed to break her spirit. Meanwhile, David was locked in a struggle of his own. The reflection was relentless, using Evelyn's memories and emotions as weapons against him. It whispered secrets only the real Evelyn would know, dredging up moments from their past together in a twisted attempt to manipulate him. Remember that time by the lake, when you promised me we'd always be together? That was real, David. You know it was. The reflection's voice was sweet, almost seductive, as it circled him like a predator. I am her. I'm everything she ever was, and more. Destroying me would be destroying her. Can you really do that? David's hands trembled, doubt creeping in. What if the reflection was right? What if, by destroying the mirror, he was condemning Evelyn to a fate worse than death? He couldn't shake the image of her, trapped, alone, inside the glass, unable to escape. But deep down, he knew the truth. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't Evelyn. It was an imposter, a parasite feeding on the real Evelyn's life. He raised the sledgehammer higher, his resolve hardening. In the mirror realm, Evelyn's thoughts raced. She could feel the mirror's grip tightening around her, the reflection's taunts echoing in her mind. She was running out of time, and the choice before her was agonizing. Would she sacrifice herself to save David and the others, or would she condemn someone else to the fate that awaited them inside the mirror? Liam stepped closer, his voice low and urgent. You have to make a decision, Evelyn, before it's too late. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. The weight of the decision felt unbearable, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let the mirror win, not without a fight. Chapter 6, The Final Reflection. David's grip tightened around the sledgehammer as he stared at the gleaming surface of the mirror. His breath came in shallow, controlled gasps, the weight of the impending decision bearing down on him. Across the room, the reflection, posing as Evelyn, stood still, her eyes narrowing in anticipation. Every muscle in David's body was tense, but his resolve was firm. He had to destroy the mirror. It was the only way to bring the real Evelyn back. The reflection, however, wasn't about to let him have his way so easily. David, she whispered, stepping closer, her voice a honeyed snare. Think about what you're doing. You're not just shattering glass, you're tearing apart everything we've built together. She reached out, her fingers barely brushing his arm, and he shuddered, recoiling from the touch. But deep down, David knew it wasn't her. It wasn't Evelyn. You're not her, he said through gritted teeth. You'll never be her. Inside the mirror realm, Evelyn faced an equally grueling battle. The twisted reality around her, dark and fractured, was suffocating. The oppressive air was thick with the weight of fear, as if the very atmosphere was alive, feeding off her every insecurity. She glanced over at Liam, who stood beside her, his face pale, eyes flickering with a strange mix of determination and something darker, something she hadn't noticed before. You need to trust me, Liam urged, his voice soft yet insistent. The only way to escape is to break the mirror from the inside. But we don't have much time. David's close to figuring it out, and if he smashes it without you being ready, you'll be trapped here. Forever? Evelyn nodded, though unease gnawed at her. There was something in Liam's tone that unsettled her, a quiet urgency that didn't feel quite right. For weeks, he had been her companion in this nightmare, her guide, her confidant. But now, as the moment of truth approached, doubts began to cloud her mind. Could she really trust him? As the ground beneath her feet shifted and the mirror world warped and twisted around them, Evelyn's thoughts turned inward. The mirror wasn't just a prison. It was a tool designed to amplify and manipulate the darkest parts of the human psyche. And she could feel it working on her, pulling at her insecurities, her regrets, her guilt. She thought of Liam, trapped for so long, guiding her through the distorted landscape of the mirror realm. But something gnawed at her subconscious. How had Liam survived all this time without succumbing to the mirror's power? The thought struck her like a bolt of lightning, and suddenly, everything fell into place. A memory flashed before her eyes. Liam's face when she first met him in this twisted reflection of reality. He hadn't looked lost. He had looked prepared. Like someone who had been waiting. "You," Evelyn began, her voice shaky as she stepped back from Liam, realization dawning on her. "You've known all along, haven't you? You weren't trying to help me escape. You were trying to take my place." Liam's eyes darkened, his once gentle demeanor twisting into something far more sinister. He smiled, a cold, lifeless grin that chilled Evelyn to her core. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "But it doesn't matter now, does it? The mirror feeds off fear, off guilt. And you've been carrying so much of both, haven't you? That's what makes you so easy to manipulate. You believed every word I said because deep down, you've always feared that you weren't enough." Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, the realization hitting her like a tidal wave. Liam wasn't the victim. He was the architect of her suffering. He had been playing her from the start, feeding on her guilt, using it to weaken her. "The real Liam died the moment he was trapped," she whispered, horror dawning in her eyes. You were the reflection all along." His smirk widened. "I am the mirror's creation, a reflection of everything Liam was and wasn't. But that doesn't change the fact that I can leave this place, Evelyn. I can take your place out there, live your life. All you have to do is give in." Evelyn shook her head, backing away. Her mind raced as the walls of the mirror realm seemed to close in around her. She had been trapped in a prison of her own making, guilt over Liam's death, fear of not being enough. But now, in the face of this ultimate betrayal, a new fire ignited within her. "I won't let you take my life," she said, her voice trembling at first, then gaining strength. "I won't let you win." Outside, David raised the hammer above his head, ready to bring it down on the cursed glass. The reflection snarled, her veneer of calm cracking as she rushed toward him, desperate to stop him. "You're making a mistake," she screamed, her voice distorted, no longer holding any semblance of the real Evelyn's warmth. "If you break that mirror, you'll destroy her." But David wasn't listening anymore. His mind was set, his heart resolute. This thing before him wasn't Evelyn. It was a twisted imitation, a hollow mockery of the woman he loved. He had to end it, no matter the cost. Inside the mirror, Evelyn faced her own climactic battle. Liam lunged at her, his once kind face now twisted into a sneer of fury. "You don't have the strength to fight me," he hissed, his voice echoing in the warped space around them. But Evelyn did have the strength. She had carried the weight of her guilt for too long, let it define her, but no more. With a surge of defiance, she fought back, not against Liam, but against the chains of her own self-doubt. She pushed him back with all her might, her mind clear for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "I am enough," she whispered to herself, her voice filled with determination. With a final desperate push, she hurled Liam into the very heart of the mirror's power. His scream echoed through the air as the mirror began to crack, the shards splintering like ice. At the same time, David brought the hammer down, smashing the glass with all his might. The mirror shattered. Evelyn felt the world around her collapse as the mirror realm crumbled. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness, an endless void. And then she felt herself pulled back, her consciousness rushing toward the surface. She awoke on the floor of her living room, gasping for breath. The mirror was gone, shattered into 1,000 pieces. David stood over her, his face pale but relieved. "Evelyn," he whispered, dropping the hammer and rushing to her side. "You're back. You're really back." She nodded, her body trembling from the ordeal. But as she glanced toward the broken shards of the mirror, a chill ran down her spine. In one of the larger pieces, she caught a glimpse of her reflection. It smiled. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it real, or was the mirror still playing tricks on her mind? David helped her to her feet, unaware of the flicker of doubt that lingered in her mind. As they stood together, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that, though the mirror was broken, its hold on her might not be fully gone. And as she walked away, leaving the shards behind, one tiny sliver of glass remained, reflecting a faint, knowing grin. The question lingered. Had she truly escaped, or was part of her still trapped in the reflection's twisted grasp?